Hello et bonjour. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. I also have the real privilege of being the project director of LEARN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. With the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, LEARN is a partnership between researchers, civil societies, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, trying to understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime. And it is our real pleasure, further to this work, to support Canada's International Development Research Centre and its network of 12 research chairs located in universities across the global south. We'll hear more about the network in a moment, but let me just say how important the work is of the IDRC chairs and how transformative it is both within the field of refugee and forced migration studies and in discussions on global policy, regional policy, national policy, and ways of enhancing our response to ensure protection and solutions with and for refugees and others who are displaced. This webinar series is evidence of the substantive value of this localized approach to knowledge. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Carleton University is situated is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. I say that not only out of respect and gratitude, but also in recognition that these questions of dislocation, dispossession, displacement that we discuss in this series, in this webinar today, is very much a part of the history of the land on which I am a guest. And I acknowledge and give thanks for the traditional caretakers of the land where I live and work. With that, let me say how delighted we are to have more than 85 registrants for this first webinar in the series organized by the network of IDRC research chairs. The goal of this series is to connect localized research of the chairs with global policy discussions on issues ranging from new approaches to protection, climate change and displacement, internal displacement, issues of gender. These issues that are very much at the top of the global policy agenda and where the research of the chairs from the context in which they work can bring new knowledge and new perspectives to enhance our collective efforts in advancing the priorities of the regime and of ensuring protection and solutions with and for refugees. We have a really fabulous group of speakers to help us engage with the roots-based approach to migration that was proposed earlier this year by UNHCR and discussed at a side event at UNHCR's Executive Committee meeting in October of this year. But before we get into the topic, I'd like to invite my wonderful friend and colleague, Roula El-Rifai, to say a few words about the network and about the chairs. Roula is a tremendous champion of issues of new approaches to research on forced displacement. She's a senior program specialist with IDRC's Democratic and Inclusive Governance team. And Roula, I'm happy to invite you to say a few words on behalf of IDRC. Roula, over to you, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, James. It's really my pleasure to be here today to participate in this first webinar of the series by the IDRC Research Chairs Network on Forced Displacement. Allow me a very short few words about this network of research chairs. The network, as James has mentioned, consists of 12 chairs based in 12 universities and 5 regions globally. They are based in universities in Peru, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Morocco, Lebanon, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Thailand. As a network, they have now been operating for the last 2 to 3 years and working closely with our colleagues from Carleton University in Ottawa. So at a time when the number of forcibly displaced and internally displaced is rising at increasingly alarming rates, compounded by conflict, sometimes very violent conflict, weak governance, economic crisis, stark gender inequalities, climate change, and so much more. Such a network of knowledge led by Global South scholars and thought leaders becomes more important than ever. It is important for several reasons. It's important so as to help us identify workable, sustainable solutions that are localized, solutions to forced displacement challenges in the context of these connected polycrises, solutions that can be scaled regionally and internationally. It's an important network to bring in and amplify the voices of those with lived experiences of displacement, voices not always heard or represented in debates about issues that affect them directly. It is a network that is important as a network of knowledge from the Global South to influence thinking at a global level, like our session today and the way James explained it really well, based on empirical and innovative research. And finally, this network which is very much interdisciplinary, is also helping us rethink the important role of university and knowledge institutions in the way they connect to community and communities of practice in their links to policy spaces. This is a challenge that is not only in the Global South, it's a challenge that is global in nature. IDRC, with its mandate to support Global South voices in research and development, is very excited how this network of research chairs on forced displacement is evolving. Thanks to all the panelists, the research chairs who are here today. Thanks to our colleague Madeline from UNHCR for joining the panel, and thanks to Carleton University for helping organize. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rula. That really sets the stage wonderfully for the discussion that we have, why it's so important in terms of timing and why it's so important in terms of the perspectives that we're going to be hearing. But before we get into the discussion of the event itself, let me just share a few words in terms of practicalities. First of all, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. So what that means is that we invite you to pose your questions, but use the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Start putting your questions in there at any time. I'll be curating those questions and posing them to the panelists when we get to the Q&A portion of today's event. I would ask you to please remember to be respectful in the way that you pose your questions in the Q&A box. Any inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or harmful language will lead to your removal from the webinar. Second, if you have any technical questions along the way, please send an email to the email address that I'm about to put in the chat box. Send an email to learn@carleton.ca if you have any technical difficulties, and the team will be there to help you out. Third and finally, please note this webinar is being recorded. There will be a report and a recording of the webinar that will be posted on the network's website in the weeks following today's event. So please keep an eye on social media for that. We look forward to sharing that report and recording, just as we look forward to sharing the conversation with our panelists today. We really hope you enjoy this webinar, and at the end of the webinar, I'll give you a sense of when the next events will be held within this series. But let's get on with the topic of today, Global South Perspectives on Roots-Based Approaches to Migration. We have three really marvelous speakers with us to engage with this important and very timely and very innovative topic within the international refugee protection regime. We're really thrilled, Madeline, to have you with us today. Madeline Garlick is the Chief of Protection Policy and Legal Advice with UNHCR in Geneva. And any of you who've been involved with global refugee protection policies discussions in recent years will know Madeline for her candor and her willingness to engage in discussion and debate. In addition to the many roles that she's played with UNHCR in contexts as diverse as engaging with European partners and in protection issues in Iraq, Madeline is very consciously and consistently involved in discussions with the academic community. And Madeline, we appreciate your presence and engagement today, but your ongoing willingness and commitment to engaging with academic partners within this broad community in which we work. So, Madeline, thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you do. And two of the IDRC research chairs that we have to speak on this topic today really present perspectives from two regions that are profoundly critical in these discussions. Matthew Bird is the IDRC research chair at Universidad del Pacifico in Peru. His research examines how critical and dynamic capabilities influence decisions both individuals and organizations make to advance what they perceive as human development in context of migration. And Matthew will be bringing the perspective from the Americas in this very critical conversation, a very potent site for migration and displacement discussions. And from the context of North Africa and the Mediterranean and Europe, we're really thrilled to have Miriam Cherti with us. Miriam is the IDRC Research Chair in Forced Displacement in Rabat in Morocco. Previously, she's held positions at the International Organization for Migration, both in the UK and in Morocco. In 2018, she was seconded by IOM to work with the Moroccan government, leading on questions relating to the Global Forum on Migration and Development, as well as the preparation and the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration in Marrakesh. So the experience that both Miriam and Matthew bring in terms of not only these issues within their regions, but the perspectives of different national and institutional actors, regional actors, global actors in these regions on these issues, we're in for a real treat today. So the way we're going to approach this is each of the speakers will have about 10 minutes. We're going to start with Madeline to understand UNHCR's perspective on this new approach to a roots-based approach to protection. We'll then hear from Matthew from the context of the Americas, and then from Miriam. Each speaker has about 10 minutes. There'll then be a discussion between the four of us, and then before we turn to your questions coming from the audience. So without further ado, Madeline, thank you for being with us. It's my pleasure to give you the floor. Madeline, over to you, please.
Thank you, James. And really, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. I really want to thank the IDRC, Learn, and all involved for the opportunity to be with you and to talk today about the root-based approach, which at its core is about the pressing issue of how we can collectively build a more effective response to mixed movements of refugees and migrants across the globe. All of us here today recognize that this touches on sensitive and challenging questions in many states and communities. And this is also one compelling reason why high quality, objective, dispassionate, and persuasive empirical research is so important in this area, including why the work that the IDRC and Learn and other academics and their partners is so crucial to inform debates, reflections, thinking, policy and lawmaking in a balanced and rational manner. We need this to provide a counterpoint to political agendas and inflammatory rhetoric around asylum and migration these days. So there are a number of imperatives which underscore the need for root-based approaches, and it's against that background that UNHCR, with partners, has been working on the root-based approach idea. And these include some phenomena which we, as HCR, working and dialoguing with people with lived experience of forced displacement and statelessness, see as the realities on the ground. This includes, firstly, increased mixed movements worldwide. We see people traveling in mixed movements in different parts of the world along many different routes, often irregularly, which include refugees fleeing persecution, war, conflict, or generalized violence in their country of origin, or who are also moving often in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. And these people in need of international protection are frequently also moving alongside others who may be moving for many reasons in search of better opportunities, including due to poor governance and acute hardship. Often the causes of such mixed movements and onward movement from one country to another are a combination of these complex factors. A second key element that we see today is that there is vast suffering along major mixed movement routes for all concerned. We also see, regrettably, international protection needs which frequently go unrecognized and unmet. Whilst refugees have distinct needs for international protection as recognized in international law, They are frequently using the same routes as migrants and facing similar vulnerabilities and risks along the way, such as falling prey to traffickers and smugglers, as well as being exposed to human rights violations, which can threaten all people on the move, regardless of their status. For far too many people, these journeys result in increased vulnerability, trauma, or loss of life. These are real, genuine challenges, but what we sometimes see is that they evoke misinformed reactions and perceptions. There's a perception in some quarters of chaotic, spontaneous arrivals at and within state borders that has raised public concern in many countries. This is fueled in some cases by anti-foreigner, anti-refugee discourse, as well as populist and xenophobic narratives. And such concerns may be exacerbated by a sense of lack of control, order, or fairness, including when people not in need of international protection or without legal stay options cannot be returned to their countries of origin in a timely, safe, and dignified manner. So there's a complex interplay of phenomena at work that calls for clear, dispassionate, rational messages and debates, but also new, original, and reinvigorated approaches to protection and to human rights. So this calls for, firstly, a change in the way in which we collectively respond to mixed movements. We believe that responding more effectively and predictably to the challenges of mixed movements requires a broad, whole-of-route approach, one that offers critical support and, where needed, access to international protection at every stage along these journeys, from countries of origin, asylum, transit, and destination. For UNHCR, it seems clear that trying to address these challenges at the borders of destination countries is too little and too late. Instead, what we need to do is find more comprehensive approaches that build on partnerships and collaboration among states focused on interventions in all countries from countries of origin. Now, let me be clear. This is not about pandering to a containment agenda. On the contrary, it's about recognizing that states at all points along movement journeys have obligations to protect and respect the human rights of refugees and migrants and to afford international protection to those who need it, and about creating conditions in which more people can find protection at all points along these journeys. UNHCR has thus worked together with IOM and other partners to frame a route-based approach which aims essentially to address three key goals. Firstly, to save lives and reduce harm along key mixed movement routes. And this entails, amongst other things, seeking to strengthen rescue at sea and on land, protection-sensitive entry systems, humanitarian assistance along the route, information and referral of individuals to appropriate channels of processes and sources of support and information. It secondly seeks to create and make accessible alternatives to dangerous journeys at all points along key routes. This means providing international protection for people who may flee as early as possible, and also setting up and managing safe, orderly, and regular pathways for refugees and migrants to obviate the need for people to feel compelled to move onwards and to put themselves into the hands of smugglers. As a third key goal, it aims to strengthen the tools, systems, and cooperation, looking to support states to strengthen their asylum capacity and more effectively manage mixed movements, including through early identification of refugees and migrants, lawful transfer arrangements, fair and efficient national asylum systems, as well as prompt, humane, dignified returns and access to lawful migration channels. I want to stress that the route-based approach is not about facilitating onward movement of refugees and migrants in an irregular manner, but rather seeking to find lawful ways to reconcile the sovereignty and little legitimate interests of states in managing their borders with the rights of refugees and migrants under international and other relevant branches of law. So we're specifically looking to try and find lawful alternatives to some of the externalization and restrictive measures that we've seen states adopting in many parts of the world. We have, as part of this routes-based approach, developed a framework which aims to capture the comprehensive nature of the approach that we think is needed to respond to these challenges through the route-based approach. So if I could have the next slide, please. So there are 6 pillars of this approach which seeks to ensure protection and respect for migrants and refugees along key routes. Firstly, the approach calls for protection-sensitive entry and admission. And this is because we see in all regions that refugees and migrants face very significant obstacles in accessing safety, territory, and effective entry systems. So to address this, we need to make sure that life-saving measures, such as rescue operations at sea, are reinforced to reduce the devastating loss of life that we see in many parts of the world along dangerous routes. This also necessitates action to ensure the principle of non-refoulement is respected, including through ending illegal pushbacks at borders. It also means that refugees need to be protected from penalisation for irregular entry and stay, which is a requirement under Article 31 of the 1951 Convention. UNHCR has just last month issued a new guideline on international protection on non-penalisation of refugees, which we hope will aid lawyers, courts, and other stakeholders to ensure they're not punished, prosecuted, detained, or denied access to asylum merely because they've been forced to enter or stay without authorisation. And I'll paste the link to that shortly in the chat. The second pillar relates to strengthening asylum systems, including for rights-based migration governance. So this calls for more robust asylum systems, enabling countries to identify those in need of international protection, whilst ensuring swift processing. Effective asylum systems are based on enabling legal frameworks, systems, and institutional capacity. We think this is increasingly important in an environment where we see many states' asylum systems overloaded with backlogs, which in some cases can undermine political and public support for asylum in a sense that the system is no longer functioning. So HCR is working with states to try and promote the strengthening of such systems and provided guidance on fair and effective processing of asylum claims. And in the context of large-scale arrivals, we're also looking to call for prima facie approaches to granting protection, or other practical measures such as the temporary protection regime that we saw rolled out in many parts of the world to respond to Ukrainian arrivals a couple of years ago. We recognise that determining asylum claims is a complex matter in the face of contemporary drivers of displacement. And HCR is seeking also to try and help states and decision makers grapple with those, including, amongst others, in the complex situation we see where many people are forced to flee because, or in the context of, the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. And again, guidance issued in recent years in 2020 by UNHCR seeks to provide more tools to help decision-making in these contexts. The third pillar focuses on addressing immediate and protection and assistance needs. And this speaks to the most urgent needs of refugees and migrants: access to food, shelter, legal aid, counselling and healthcare, including specialised care for women, children and survivors of trauma and violence who may need it. This, we think, is a key area where there are too many gaps in parts of the world where many people in vulnerable situations are travelling. The fourth pillar speaks of ensuring inclusion and development. And this is because we believe a more inclusive approach to migration can prevent the need for dangerous journeys from happening in the first place. States can support this by investing in policies that can ensure access to legal status, services and job opportunities, and can also promote access for refugees in line with their entitlements under the 1951 Convention and other legal frameworks. The fifth pillar speaks to safe, regular and complementary pathways to third countries. And this is because we believe that one of the most effective ways to reduce irregular movement is by expanding opportunities for people to move by lawful means. There's a serious shortage of resettlement places, we know, and we need more opportunities for refugees who are in vulnerable situations to benefit from these, but also for other options such as family reunification, work and study visa opportunities to be expanded. We see many individuals, particularly families, who see the only chance to reunite with loved ones as being undertaking a dangerous, irregular journey. The fact that family reunification is part of the legislation of so many destination countries underscores the vital need and the opportunities to strengthen access to those entitlements which people have under national law. But this means navigating complex bureaucracies and also ensuring that people have the right advice and support to do that. And I'm very pleased to say that just today, UNHCR has issued new guidance on international legal standards relating to family reunification for refugees and beneficiaries of international protection that addresses some of these important issues. And I'll also post that in the chat, hot off the presses right now. And then the final pillar you see here is safe, dignified return and reintegration. And this emphasises the importance of ensuring that individuals who are not in need of international protection and who do not have any other legal right to stay can return safely to their home countries in a way that reflects human rights standards. This requires international cooperation and adherence to human rights principles by all states concerned. We need to see states who have an obligation to receive back their own nationals cooperating more effectively in this regard to ensure humane outcomes to people who in many other cases otherwise find themselves stranded in limbo for years on end. We also believe that by fostering agreements and cooperations that uphold the dignity and rights of returning migrants, we can strengthen the integrity and credibility of the international protection system as a whole, as many of the questions that are posed in some parts of the world about asylum relate to the fact that all those who apply are staying indefinitely regardless of the outcome. We have also a number of enablers and cross-cutting elements that are associated with the route-based approach, which are featured on this slide. I won't go into these in detail through lack of time, but I do encourage anybody that's interested to look at the explainer on this concept in order to learn more. And I just want to really say that we are working further on this approach and seeking to try and develop ideas and policy options, programs and interventions that can put this into practice. But it's not something that UNHCR wants to or can pursue alone. We really want to work with partners, including researchers, including states, including civil society, advocates, and refugees and migrants. So we really welcome the opportunity to cooperate with anybody working in this field who would be interested and look forward to discussing it further with you today and potentially thereafter. Thank you very much, James, and back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Madeline. A really helpful overview that I think provides a really solid foundation that when you first hear the idea of a roots-based approach, it can conjure up many different images. And I think the way that you presented it around the pillars really, not to the pillars make for a strong foundation, as we've known from architects throughout history. And it was really encouraging in the enabling factors, the notion of data and evidence and research as being sort of the starting point. And something that we'll, I think, discuss throughout the event today is whose research and whose knowledge, and how to make sure that research that comes from perspectives that advance particular or engage with particular policy paradigms is balanced with a range of perspectives. And so it's in the spirit of understanding the need for diverse perspectives and sites of knowledge production, Matthew, that I'm happy to pass the floor to you to give your thinking on how this roots-based approach might work in the context of the Americas, what issues it raises, what questions will need to be asked, and what opportunities that you see. So, Matthew, happy to pass the floor to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, James. And thank you, IDRC and Learn for the support and organization of this webinar. Thank you so much, Madeline, for your participation today and enabling this conversation that we're going to have. And also, I really appreciate, as James was saying, kind of the way that you really clearly set up the need for a change of paradigm, a different approach. You open with this idea of kind of, we have this increased mixed movements, right? And they're being caused by just, it's extremely complex, right? A combination of causes, multiple factors, and understanding both refugee movements and migrant movements and what have you. And really what it requires is a change of approach, hence the need for the roots-based programming. And in that spirit, kind of, the concept is there. There's a strong justification for it, but in that spirit is, what does it mean if you're to take this roots-based approach and to take it to particular regions? And so I'll speak about, from my perspective, from Peru, from the Global South, of what that means in the Americas. And so I'll just start with, this is actually something out of a current IDRC funded research project that we're doing. And it's an interview with a Venezuelan man that would just last week that we were speaking to, who's in Mexico. And I think I'm just going to share this really quick vignette because I think it really highlights the potential, the opportunities, but also the challenges of roots-based programming. So this Venezuelan man, he actually had left Venezuela just prior to the pandemic, 2018, 2019, and he made his way through a little bit of time in Peru, but then kind of came to Chile just before the pandemic, and had been in Chile. And increased xenophobia, discrimination, challenges in Chile, and at the middle of this year, he and some family members decided that they wanted to then go north. They tried to make their way to the U.S. And he's now in Mexico City with some family members. And he basically, I think this is what the point where I wanted to get to is he is thinking right now of his options. Of I'm here. He actually is waiting for an asylum an interview with the U.S. I'm not sure if he was turned away at the border or if he applied from Mexico, but he's waiting for that interview, and he's very aware of the change of the government in the U.S. And what's so fascinating is he's very clear-eyed about his options, and he's not just thinking of a whole of roots approach; he's thinking of a whole of region calculus. And so, literally in this interview, this is how he was thinking. He goes, "Well, what are my options with my family? I can return to Chile. That's one. I can basically see what happens if I get my interview before the change of government in the U.S. So he's still waiting for gain of entry to the U.S. He's actually also waiting for what's going to happen with the political transition in Venezuela. So he's considering he would love to return home to Venezuela. But at the same time, he's also thinking, well, I could just stay here in Mexico, or maybe some pathways for me to go to Spain. And he literally, and I think that's what's so fascinating about that is I think on one hand, it justifies, as you were saying, Madeline, why we need a whole of roots approach here uh, um, from a displaced person's perspective, but also the challenges that is, because it's not, in a sense, it's not just a whole of root. This is a whole of region calculus and multiple potential routes. And so I say that, and I kind of as an entry point, because each of the 3 points that I would like to make in terms of how we can think about what it means to bring the roots-based programming to the Americas and the implications of that, and the evidence needs that we need for kind of data-driven implementation. I would like to touch on 3 points. So the first is the concept of mixed flows that you discussed, Madeline. Well, you discussed all 3 of these. The second one is the rights-based alternatives to externalization proposals. And the third is, reflect a little more on what this whole of root approach mean. What are the implications, and which route or routes or what have you, because resources are scarce and there's inevitably going to be prioritizations. So just starting with the mixed flows, and I won't go too much into this because I know my colleague Miriam will want to say a little more, but I'll speak more from the Latin American's perspective. It's extremely challenging to make these distinctions, as we know, between refugees and migrants and the mixed flows. In both, we have definitions in international law, conventions, compacts. We have an agency infrastructure set up around this distinction. But at the same time, we know that we have different definitions by country. By country and with different operating definitions, but also by region. We have, for example, the Cartagena Declaration, which has a less restrictive definition of refugees and migrants and who are those in need of protection. And what's interesting to reflect on, I think, if we were going to bring this to this approach to the Americas, is how do we understand these mixed flows and whose definitions will be used, right? Because as they move through from origin, transit, destination, even return, it could be not their origin country return. These definitions are going to shift. And one is just the Americas versus kind of North America, the Cartagena Declaration, which we know is less restrictive and has been incorporated into 15 country laws in Latin America and the Caribbean. The other is right now, that's even changing because we're going through the Cartagena, I'm thinking in Spanish here, Más 40 plus 40, the Cartagena plus 40 process, which is actually one of the goals, and you mentioned climate, is for them to say, what does Cartagena mean for climate change and displacement? Because, it was done in 1984 and realizing the needs to give some guidance on application of Cartagena to those cases. And a much more kind of expansive and inclusive. Even Argentina, for example, already has a humanitarian visa, for example, for reception of natural disasters. So in many senses, historically, Latin America has been very progressive in terms of these definitions compared to some other areas, countries. And finally, these definitions also highlights, and you mentioned this, Madeline, what are the root causes of migration displacement? And these are these data needs. We still say so extremely complex, but in the Americas, how do we understand these root causes and change within that? Is it a mediator? Is it a primary cause, secondary cause? Is it a multiplier of threats, et cetera? and so that's one piece, the definitions. But the other piece is, as you move along, and I'll let Miriam speak more to this, but as you move along the route, the individual migrant or asylum seeker moves along the route, the experiences that they have along the routes as well could change their eligibility perhaps for protection, right? And I'm thinking in terms of exposure to violence, conflict, even extortion, or being their own families being extorted back in their origin countries as they may be detained unlawfully by traffickers. And then finally, and this is research that we've done, we shouldn't lose sight of the self-definition of these of displaced persons. And I'll just give you a quick example that we have done in Peru, looking at Venezuelans as they were moving across the border from Ecuador to Peru, and then we followed them up 6 months later as they were in Peru. And we asked them at the border, would you consider, without definitions, would you consider yourself a migrant or a refugee? And they said there are a certain percentage breakdown. Some people said refugee, some people said migrant, but we didn't give them definitions, right? And then we read them the Cartagena definition. Would you consider yourself a migrant or refugee? And of course, what happens, as you can imagine, is the self-definition, once they understand the legal or the Cartagena definition, many more people are considering themselves, wait a minute, I'm eligible for protection here under this definition. But then if you follow them up 6 months later, you get a further evolution, actually more towards kind of migrant, self definitions of migrants. And so I think it's interesting and important to keep that in mind. We don't want to lose the experiences and the displaced person's perspective. The other piece, rights-based alternatives and externalization proposal and expulsion practices. From Latin America, I think it's very interesting, and there's been some interesting interventions already. I'm going to speak to the safe mobility offices that have been set up in the Americas, but also the opportunities and challenges that those present. So for those kind of listening now or on the recording, this is kind of coming out of a Los Angeles Declaration, kind of initially US-led effort to kind of encourage more regional coordination to movements in the Americas. And so they set up safe mobility offices in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Colombia. And I'll just use an example of the Safe Mobility Office in Colombia that I know about. And what's fascinating is the logic is there, right? It's what you were saying, Madeline, of, you don't want to have people that you want them to have better information. You want them, to be able to go to these offices, to apply for asylum, to not risk the vulnerability of going along these routes, being subjected to crossing the Darien Gap and to traffickers and what have you. But at the same time, it also can create additional stress on these transit countries. So Colombia, for example, Venezuelans can apply in either kind of, now I think extracontinentals even can apply for asylum within Colombia. But we'd also know that Colombians are also kind of origin countries for some movements, and also Ecuador, where safe mobility offices, but they cannot apply, right? But at the same time, because you have that safe mobility office, it actually could actually create incentives for increased arrivals of these of people seeking asylum and access to these offices. So it creates it both helps solve issues, kind of protecting people from applying for asylum before risking without risking going along these very dangerous routes. But at the same time, it creates pressures for that would have to be managed, right, for these transit countries. And then finally, I'm aware of time, so I'll just skip to the whole of route approach. And this is just a very quick, and I think this extends from the example I gave of the Venezuelan man, is which routes? We know that routes and flows are going all sorts of different directions, and we know just from a migrant or displaced person perspective that we may think about routes kind of going to the U.S. border, but in reality, they're routes that emerge, develop, change. I mean, that over time, right? And so I think one of the things to think about is which routes are being focused on, where are resources being put, and what kind of what does that mean, right? And especially, and this is the last thing I'll say, is when you put into an infrastructure, routes-based programming infrastructure, you're actually putting in literal offices and you're dedicating resources. And there's I think one could raise concerns that these could be kind of empty shells, if you will, an infrastructure that are empty shells that as as political as governments change and whoever has kind of influence over the use of this infrastructure, these shells could be very quickly redirected to fulfill different purposes, right? So I think one of the challenges is how can you, going back to what you were saying and what the intention is, really have rights-based alternatives to these externalization proposals, but how do you make sure that they continue to be rights-based, right? Without very quickly exploiting that infrastructure for non-rights-based approaches in deterrence. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it back over to James.
Yeah, no, Matthew, thank you very much. Very, very rich. And I really appreciate, starting with the vignette and bringing in the evidence that you have. And I think it speaks, Madeline, to the point that you made about the importance of evidence in relaying the foundation of how these conversations can unfold, and also rebalancing, the sites of knowledge that contribute to this. The last point that you raised, Matthew, we'll come back to that for sure in the discussion time, because there's a structural flaw in the way that international cooperation around refugee protection and solutions, the way that it was designed by states themselves in the aftermath of World War II, was based on voluntary contributions. So while 75% of the world's displaced are in the global south, more than 85% of voluntary contributions come from states in the global north that have their own policy priorities. And so I think this is something I hope we'll be able to, if we can solve that in the discussion time today, I can change the tack of my research. I'd be grateful for that. But that really, really critical points that you raised, Matthew. And now, so from that, Miriam, let's turn to you, because I know that some of these dynamics are also present in the context of North Africa, but almost amplified in a certain way, given the geography and given the politics of the region. That there are similarities, but there are also important differences. So, Miriam, let me pass the floor to you to hear your perspective, please. Miriam, go ahead.
Thank you so much, James, for your kind introduction, and thank you, IDRC, for this opportunity to exchange and for all the work you've put in behind this, organizing this webinar series. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and bring in this perspective on the Mediterranean migration routes. So also thanks to Madeline, both Madeline and Matthew, for laying the ground for me. Since I only have 10 minutes, and I'll try and focus my presentation into kind of 3 key parts. So the first one, I would like to give a bit of a kind of concrete overview on the sort of regional context by looking at some of these migration routes, at least as they exist at the moment. Then second, reflect on some key considerations for applying the route-based approach in the region. And finally, maybe reflect on some sort of recommendations and way forward. So if you don't mind, please, the first slide. So as James mentioned just now, so as we all know, close to 70% of all refugees are hosted in countries neighboring their own. However, in recent years, and as Madeline also has highlighted, there's been this increase of mixed flows of migrants and refugees taking the same routes. So in the kind of Mediterranean region, they're primarily for migration kind of routes. So there is the Western Africa Atlantic route to Spain and towards the Canary Islands. Then we've got the Western Mediterranean route to Peninsular Coast and to Ceuta and Melilla in northern Morocco. And then we've got the Central Mediterranean route to Italy and Malta, and finally the Eastern Mediterranean route to Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Greece. So these are migration routes from countries from the Middle East, or even Southeast Asia and Africa regions through the Mediterranean Sea and to Europe, have been used since the early 2000s. And the majority of arrivals cross all 4 migratory routes in the Mediterranean were by sea. And as you can see from this map, just to give you a bit of a glimpse into, and this is drawing on IOM's kind of displacement tracking matrix data. So you could see in this first part of 2024, from January until September, you could see that the majority of the crossings were by sea, so 130,000 versus around 14,000 by land, which highlights the high risk that comes with these sea routes. A second slide, please. And here on this second slide, I would like to, so we've got two graphs. So the first one on the left shows the total number of arrivals. I'm kind of zooming into Spain. So by land and by sea between 2016 and 2024, with a peak number of arrivals around 2018, and a slight decrease during the COVID pandemic. And this is important to kind of highlight how these kind of, how these routes are used and kind of become popular and popular depending on so many other external factors. But also, how the kind of the response from smugglers and adjust to kind of increase border security, etc. So on the second graph to the right, we can see the evolution of the Western migration routes, both land and sea, and also the West Africa Atlantic route based on arrivals in Spain around the same period. And what's interesting here is that the arrivals to Canary Islands represented 73% of all arrivals to Spain, with the most of the rest being represented by arrivals through mainland Spain, only representing around 22%. So that's an interesting kind of progression. Again, only 5% of the total arrivals was represented in the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. The third slides. So as I mentioned earlier, so with these kind of sea crossings, the risk and danger increases, and I'm drawing here on data from IOM's Missing Migrant Project. And this last graph shows that the West Africa Atlantic route to the Canary Islands has witnessed a significant surge in arrivals in 2023, making 155% increase compared to the year before. So in this in 2023, the Missing Migrant Project, as you could see from the graph, has recorded 953 migrants who died, and more than 71% increase compared to the year before. So these are recurrent unfortunate incidents that highlight the need for or the urgency for having this route-based approach to address some of these challenges. And now I'll move to the second part of my presentation, where I try and reflect on some contextual considerations for applying the route-based approach in the region. As we all know, the political instability in some of these countries make the kind of security response to mixed migration flows a priority, which undermines inevitably the protection of most of the migrants and refugee populations. This is a real challenge in terms of ensuring a coordinated state-led response along the migration routes in the region. The geographic proximity to Europe and the growing externalization of border controls lead states to take reactive decisions and focus on border control to stop all mixed flows, regardless of those who need international protection. At sea, for instance, authorities continue to intercept, rescue people in distress and returning them to places that are not considered safe for disembarkation. So even though all the countries along these, the three sections of the route have signed the convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. Some have not yet developed an asylum system and consider irregular stay as a criminal offense. IOM, of course, and UNHCR, as well as other governments in the region, have stepped up life-saving protection services and assistance, as well as identification and referral mechanism along the route. However, these remain largely insufficient and hence the kind of high number of casualties. So while route-based approach is certainly a step forward in terms of ensuring international protection of and respect of human rights, perhaps the frame of reference remains a global north one, because implementing it in the southern shore of the Mediterranean and moving towards a responsibility sharing frame would necessitate a shift from border control frame that has also been a source of revenue for many of these countries. As Matthew mentioned earlier, so the categorization of who counts as a refugee and at which point of their journey is a complicated and variable issue. So while the main drivers of these mixed flows range from conflict, violence, persecution, the growing effects of climate have also become displacement multipliers, and lack of economic opportunities persist as a key driver, compelling people to move. So all these factors combined make it very challenging to disentangle one key driver forcing individuals to move. So, but also another specificity of the region is that most refugees in the region do not live in camps, but instead move to cities. And in fact, most people choose to settle in these urban areas, making the proportion of migrants and refugees and internally displaced persons in cities higher than for national territories. So cities then become, and local governments are essential key stakeholders for the implementation of the route-based approach. And so therefore more focus on reinforcing governance systems at the local level to support these populations is crucial. And maybe kind of by way of sort of looking up into or forward into recommendations, I think few ideas that I would like to share, and maybe I'll leave the rest until discussion, but a couple of them are around the need for a more context-specific implementation of this route-based approach, allowing a more comprehensive response. And I could see that Madeleine has referred to this already in her presentation and the 6 pillars. So this contextualized approach would need to draw more on the global compact on refugees, but also the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And it's also important in this context not to inadvertently kind of to pit migrants against refugees, as if the migrants, are actually causing this kind of strain. And secondly, I think and a clear, obvious one is that countries that have not yet done that have not ratified the convention relating to the status of refugees and the protocols there to transpose it in national legislation along the convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. Lastly, kind of balance the overall attention given to the tragedies happening in the Mediterranean Sea with the real horrors faced by refugees and migrants in the Sahara Desert and other land portions of the route. So establishing an effective and well-resourced response to arrest of migration on land involving governments, local authorities and communities, as well as civil societies and obviously international organizations. I think I'll stop there. I've got more to say, but I'll stop there for the sake of discussion. Thank you very
No,
much.
Miriam, superb. Thank you so much. And thank you to all three speakers. You've left us with half an hour for discussion, which is just superb. And Miriam, I think the point that you make about, the tools that we have at our disposal, the work that's been done with cities, the GCM and the GCR, it's a question of how all of these tools are brought together. But there's clearly no one size fits all approach, right? What's going to work in one region or one part of one region? And Matthew, to your point, one route within a region, right? That this is going to be so contextual, but in such an intense policy environment. So I have some questions I'd like to pose, but before I do, let me do two things. Number one, to everyone in the audience, please use the Q&A box to pose your questions or to share your comments. Soyez libre de poser des questions en français dans la boîte Q&A et moi je peux le traduire pour le reste. Alors, soyez libre de poser des questions en anglais ou en espagnol. And we can translate for everyone else. I'd like to acknowledge that in the audience, if we were in a physical space, I'd be able to point them out, but no, we have colleagues from the network, IDRC research chairs joining us from Thailand, Tanzania, and Lebanon. So three other contexts where this notion of roots present themselves in different ways. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. The first one has arrived. I will be curating these questions along the way. But before I begin, let me ask Beatrice if you could put that that citation and that link in the chat box for everyone to see. I'd be grateful. I was really struck in the discussion. Matthew, you made the point about 40 years since Cartagena, and today the Cartagena plus 40 event that's happening. Miriam, you made the point about it's been more than 20 years since we've seen movements within these regions. It was in 1998 that B.S. Chimney, the great scholar, published or first gave this lecture at the Refugee Studies, what was the Refugee Studies program at Oxford, and then published this piece talking about the geopolitics of refugee studies, a view from the South. And he made the point that so long as research capacity is concentrated in the global North, knowledge will be produced in a way that speaks to the policy paradigms and the policy priorities of global North actors. And it was very controversial at the time, but I think in this conversation, we see that coming home to roost in a certain way. And so those of you who aren't familiar with the work, I'd encourage you to read it. Because it's interesting, in just last month, Human Rights Watch issued an open letter to EU decision makers signed by some 50 organizations, calling for a more engaged approach, a less defensive approach from the European Union. And in that piece, they highlight that this roots-based approach is a really important way of improving global asylum governance and migration management in a rights-respecting way. The concern, however, is that it's done in a way that doesn't have this underlying objective of stemming and reducing arrivals to Europe, and that the evidence doesn't just come from evidence research that's commissioned by the European Union that sort of speaks to those points of reference. So, this is, clearly an important aspect within this. Matthew, we've heard from you, and Miriam from you, about the importance of there being different sites from which knowledge can be presented. Madeline, in your presentation, you said very, very clearly from the top that this is not about advancing containment or extraterritorialization. But given the politics of research, given the politics of knowledge, given the politics of financial contributions, and given the clear interest that we see in the two regions we've been talking about, Europe in the context of Mediterranean and North Africa, and North American states, or specifically the United States, and the focus on the U.S.-Mexico border. A question that I have for the three of you is, how can we encourage a global conversation on this approach in a way that presents that balanced understanding of opportunities? How do we do this in a way that doesn't feed into these concerns or these agendas around extraterritorialization? So it's really a question about how do we strike the balance of, on the one hand, needing to, everyone will agree that the status quo is not adequate, that new approaches are clearly needed. Do you have thoughts on how we can approach a discussion about context-specific ways of thinking through and implementing the approach in a way that doesn't become consumed or overshadowed by the priorities of those very powerful actors in both regions, who are also the donors who will need to be involved in supporting the kinds of approaches that we discuss? So I'm wondering if anyone wants to take this, how do we continue this conversation in a way that strikes that balance that we've all called for? Who'd like to start us off with an answer to that question? Madeline, fantastic. Over to you, please, Madeline.
Thank you, James. I'm delighted to do so. And I should just also introduce my colleague, Emily Winblad-Mathis, who's just turned her camera on. She's a senior protection coordinator with UNHCR who works with us here in headquarters, specifically coordinating work globally on the route-based approach. So very well placed to engage in the discussion. James, I'm very interested to take up your question, and I know there's some very pertinent questions that some of the participants have also now posted in the Q&A. So happy to move to some of them when you want to do so in the exercise of your moderator's role. But on your question, how to avoid being co-opted, if you like, or having our ideas on the route-based approach cherry-picked so that states or other actors take what they want from them and not the protective and safeguarding elements. Well, the way we really need to do that, first of all, is to explain in proper detail the enormous benefits that we see for states in taking a comprehensive approach. We firmly believe that some of the short-term knee-jerk reactions we see in the form of restrictive policies, non-entree policies, closing of legal access ways and efforts to try and stem arrivals at borders aren't working. We believe that this is a formula that's going to be ultimately a failure for states in terms of their goals of seeking to manage arrivals more effectively, and certainly in terms of enabling people who are on the move to get access to rights and to protection where needed. So first of all, properly analysing the problem that needs to be solved here. In our view, that will lead us to a clear conclusion that it needs to be a comprehensive approach. I think a second way we need to do that is ensure that the dialogue around these issues are inclusive, so that we hear from the local leaders that Miriam has referred to as being so important, local governments who are the first line responders to people on the move in many cases, and who will speak to governments, we hope, about the interest they have in ensuring that people can get access to services so that they don't feel the need to go clandestine, to be irregular, to be resorting to crime, or to be exposed to dangerous coping mechanisms, amongst many other things. I think really also by emphasizing that for this to work, it has to be a comprehensive approach. We can also avoid some of the more short-term or politically opportunist approaches to these issues. We need to point out that in order to ensure that you have protection-sensitive entry management that does recognize that states are entitled to protect their borders, we need to highlight that there needs to be lawful ways for people to come in. And that includes systems that do enable people who are seeking protection at borders to get access to territory, but also that there are legal migration channels available for migrants who otherwise move on in desperation, who resort to the services of smugglers in ways that fuel criminality, which is not in states' interest either. We also think it's really important to recognize that in today's environment, many states in the global north have very significant labor market needs. And it's also in their interest to seek to address those through having more effective legal migration channels, as well as making use of the skills of refugees and asylum seekers on their territory through access to the labour market there. So we think the case can clearly be made why it is that states need to take this comprehensive approach and not merely to seek to respond to migration by seeking to prevent entry. Perhaps if I could just before I conclude as well, I think it's important also to note, in response to Miriam's legitimate question, what this approach is seeking to do is absolutely not just to solve the problems of Europe or of the global north more broadly. What we see is that states that are along key movement routes are under extreme pressure, and many of them are also feeling compelled to take restrictive measures and approaches to arrivals. They need support and help to be able to manage the arrivals of refugees, bearing in mind that, as Miriam said, it's well over 3/4 of the world's refugees that are in low and middle income countries. And we need to recognize that there are many people who would like very much to be able to reach safety and to get access to economic and other opportunities in their regions of origin, therefore being better equipped to then return home ultimately when the moment might permit that. Much global movement is south-south, and that's disregarded also in the policy responses of many global north states. They should be seeking to foster that in creative, lawful, and constructive ways for the benefit of states and individuals alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Matthew and Miriam, your thoughts on this, on the question about, advancing this discussion while not being overwhelmed by those, by those political agendas. So, do either of you want to come in on this?
I think, well, I'll just make 2 quick points. I think the first one is that, it's for this approach to work, and it is a comprehensive approach, it still shouldn't come across as a kind of a reactive approach to existing, challenges. So we're following the new routes, or is it existing routes that we're addressing? Are we going to, so how do we do that in a sense that it's not, just other actors kind of dictating the agenda of this route-based approach, if you see what I mean? I think, smugglers will always find new routes to take migrants and refugees across, and so how do we go around this? And the second point is more around this kind of question, and unfortunately, well, fortunately, this is not happening anymore, but we've had this discussion in the UK around this sort of offshoring with Rwanda of asylum asylum seekers and not sort of cutting or shutting the door across all irregular migrants, including those who need international protection. So how do we kind of make that model, or luckily it's not going ahead, but how do we make it less attractive for countries in the global south so that they're not jumping for that, because that means kind of funding and resources coming to their country. So I think those are sort of 2 reflections that sorry, thank you.
No, thank you, Miriam. Matthew, did you want to come in? Should we go to the next?
Yeah, can I add a few things? Is that okay? Yeah, no, just follow up on what Madeline said. I think as researchers, it's our responsibility is also what you're saying in terms of what's at stake with the comprehensive approach, and really putting evidence behind the benefits of it, really hard evidence behind it. And I think in general, and just bringing this back out, I think in general, in terms of going back to your question, James, in terms of kind of balancing, both concerns in the global south and of course the global north, and responsibility sharing, but the capacity to absorb these peoples. I think there's a lot of it. There's a policy framing too, and there's evidence that should put behind this. But one of the things I think is interesting about Latin America, and I can't speak to Africa, and I see many of my colleagues in the audience and Miriam here, but I think one of the things that's interesting to think about is Latin America is a middle-income region, right? It's Latin America in terms of capacity. There's lots of issues and lots of problems in Latin America, but there is certain level of capacity, right, and level of economic development in the region. And so one of the things we've been working on and is, how can we kind of reframe when we talk to governments about integration? Because, there isn't the history, the large, this, James, very well, large history of camp policy in Latin America, right? It's what Miriam's saying. It's about, people just integrating. It's basically managed by labor migrations, in a sense, people moving to urban centers and integrating socioeconomically into these societies. Even as they move through. And so I think the challenges in terms of evidence is how can we think about taking the humanitarian perspective, but bringing it to the development perspective, right? How can we bridge that better in terms of framing? And I think there's large, I think there's also reality. We need to, you're looking just raw percentages of the percentage of the US population, for example, that was born abroad. It's around, latest numbers, it's around 15%. The percentage of the Colombian population, the Peruvian population, Ecuadorian population that's born abroad is less. It's between 3 and 5%, right? And so in terms of, and these are middle income countries, there's enormous issues, especially what's happening in Ecuador right now. But we could go to Chile. I could just name a bunch of countries, right? And so there is, I would argue that there is a capacity for effective socioeconomic integration and responsible sharing that could be framed. And so the challenge is, how do you move past a zero sum mindset of, which is very natural, it happens in any kind of receiving country, and framing it with, because what all these countries are having a challenge with is social inclusion, and they all have pretty well developed development social inclusion policies. And so basically, I'll give you an example. Peru right now wants entry into the OECD. I don't start to get wonkish here, but Peru wants entry into the OECD. In order for Peru to gain entry to the OECD, there's certain kind of development indicators that they need to achieve. One of them is just the percentage of the economy that's informal, right? 70% of the economy is informal right now. About 80, 85, 90% of the Venezuelan population in Peru works in the informal economy. Solutions that you can find to solve informality are going to help both Venezuelans and Peruvians, and it's going to contribute to a national development agenda, right? And I could go down the board in terms of education services, health services, financial inclusion. There's been some interesting developments where financial entities, and it's been pretty cross-partner, have basically, in understanding livelihoods and sustainment in these countries, have basically used kind of the Venezuelan population, because they're very digitalized. They're really more digitalized than kind of native populations, and using those as opportunities to innovate. In terms of extending credit or what have you, overcoming these institutional barriers to financial inclusion, and then they actually are capacity building for these organizations that they can then naturally apply what they're learning to non-included Colombian populations or Peruvian populations. My point is I think there's it's about evidence, and whether we're talking about benefits in destination countries, something, if the transit countries with this approach may become also destination countries or what have you. I think there's a bridge that we can have in terms of generating evidence for the benefits of a comprehensive approach, and the benefits of, if we think about this in terms of capacity for absorption as a development opportunity. For especially middle income countries. I can't speak to lower income countries, which are more dominant in Africa.
Yeah, no, terrific. And I think that bridges really well to the questions that we've had in the Q&A box. There are questions that are generally, on this question of, the zero-sum approach, the tools that we have at our disposal. I think I would characterize that there are three types of questions that we have in terms of the questions in the Q&A box as it follows from the discussion. And I know, Madeline, that you're keen to take Leonard's question specifically, so we'll come to that in a moment. And Emily, I'm keen for you to be able to engage with this discussion as well in the way that these issues are playing out in your own work. What I'm going to do is let me sort of characterize the three baskets of questions that we have in the Q&A box. And then with the time remaining, I'll pass it back to you on which of these elements you'd like to speak to in your response. Of course, we could continue, and we should continue this conversation well beyond the end time of the webinar. But let me characterize it in this way. The first kinds of questions that we've had are very much around the balancing of political will and the legal basis for this work. Leonard's question is very specific around the suitability of the legal tools that we currently have and whether new legal tools are required. But I think it more generally raises this question that we are advancing this new approach at a time where power is eclipsing principles, where interests seem to be more important than norms. And so, given this current political environment, what is the need, but also the appetite for new legal tools that could buttress this approach? I note that today is the opening of the Cartagena plus 40 ministerial meeting in Santiago. So, within this and given this imbalance, given the risk of this zero-sum approach, is there a greater potential in looking for solutions in regional contexts, in regional standards, in regional agreements? So the first question around, given this balance of given the political time in which we find ourselves, do we have the legal tools that we need? Do we need new legal tools? But also, will those legal tools be found at a regional or at a global level? So that's question one. Easy question. Question number two is very much in relation to a question of terminology. That some of the questions in the chat box have been, what would this approach be replacing? Is this a protection-based approach? Are we talking about vulnerability? Are we talking about drivers or causes of displacement? So within this, there's the concern about the language of mixed migration. And I think that Matthew and Miriam, in your presentations, there's been that question of, does the language of mixed migration presuppose that we can unmix, that there are individuals that fit these archetypes of those in need of protection and those who are moving for voluntary and economic means. So it does this language of mixed migration and the politics of labeling need to be more a part of the question that we ask? And then the final question that I would pose, Miriam, it builds from your presentation about the tools that we have at the city level with municipal partners. Fiona put the question in the chat box, and Beatrice, if I can ask you to post that now for everyone in the chat box. Fiona raised the question of the IFRCs, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, their work around, taking roots-based approaches as well. So the final question that I will pose to you all is, what are, Madeline, you made it very clear this is something that will require a massive collective effort to sort of not only think through this new approach, but to make sure that it's implemented in a context-specific way. So any thoughts that you have about the different partners that can and should be included, and the thinking that you have seen in other conversations? So Miriam, you mentioned like within the GCM discussions. What are the other conversations that you have been involved with that can be usefully brought into this conversation? So I'll start in the reverse order. And Madeline, given that you have relocated, you've taken a roots-based approach within UNHCR headquarters, I'll come to you last because just to let you get settled. Matthew, maybe I'll start with you, and then Miriam and Emily and Madeline, your final comments. I invite you all to take 2 or 3 minutes with the elements of those questions that we've heard. Matthew, if I could start with you, please.
So I think, yeah, great questions. I think I'll just drill down a little more. I don't have much more to say. I'll just drill down a little more on the politics of labeling. I think this is an enormous challenge, right? Because I think the realities are we have international law, conventions, and compacts, and agency infrastructure set up with this distinction, and it's like a built house. It's very hard to change that, right? But then kind of what I was problematizing was how you have I mean, everyone is operating with this distinction, but the distinctions that they're making are different, right? And that's just historically. And now we're getting, as Madeline was kind of laid out, is, when we're talking about at the beginning, we're talking about climate, like where do we place all of this? And I think this is a really interesting comment. I think conceptually, almost it's really complicated, but it's almost easier to think about conceptually because we're not bounded by law, conceptually. We're not bounded by law in agency infrastructure and what have you. But I do think that, we're getting to a point where Abeba in the Q&A is saying, are we talking about refugee versus migrant, or are we talking about continuums of vulnerability and need of protection? Instead of being categorical, is there some type of continuous? And it's not easy to do that legally, right? And I know it's enormously problematic, right, to put into practice. But I think our realities are telling us otherwise. I don't have an answer, but it's a challenge. It's enormous.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Miriam, I'm going to come to you, and then Emily, and then Madeline, because Emily, I know you have a hard stop in about 5 minutes. So, Miriam, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're all great questions, and yeah, it's difficult to kind of just pick one. But I mean, just by way of kind of wrapping up and concluding, I think for my part, obviously, it's crucial that we are in a stage of where we're able to implement this route-based approach in different contexts, in different regional contexts. And to be able to do this, we'll have to, have the kind of the legal basis as well as the right partners to be able to move forward. And it is the level of implementation of this route-based approach that will indicate the success. Inevitably, of course. I think we do have existing frameworks, of course. I mean, the GCR, the GCM, they're very comprehensive frameworks that will enable, and even in the kind of 4-page document describing this approach, a lot of references are drawn from those two frameworks. And this is important. So we're not kind of starting something new. This is a continuation of existing framework. So, and I think that the crucial bit is the implementation, of course, and who with. As I mentioned, I'm very keen on kind of focusing on the kind of municipal and local authorities and their key role in this, and their capacity to kind of create reception and referral systems and promote inclusivity and access to services, etc. I think there are other sort of partners and like at times of crisis, and we've seen this with the climate crisis and so you've got other hidden partners, so like the diaspora, for instance, from these different communities on the move, they can provide quite a bit of assistance, financial and in terms of know-how, etc. I think in the end, I mean, I'll try and be quick, but I think the expanding the kind of protection and assistance for migrants and refugees along these migratory routes as they evolve is crucial for sure. But I think most importantly is the provision of safe and legal routes to people on the move in the first place, instead of like trying to avoid this kind of risky and dangerous journeys down the line and avoiding that in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I think that's a very compelling point. Emily, I'm happy to pass the floor to you on points that you would like to share. Any responses? Emily, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, and really great to be with everyone here for this important conversation. I just wanted to reflect on a few of the things that were said, also having worked on the route-based approach now for some time, and including in many conversations with the IFRC on their route-based approach. And I think one of the things that to me is really important about this is that, you know, we are in a very complex and very difficult situation. I think we spoke about this, the complexity of why people move, the gravity of what we see. So to me, it's not so much about, you know, will this approach now solve everything, or will it? It is about what are the tools that it give us, or framework to talk to some of these very complex issues. And as Madeline laid out in the beginning for us, it's really around, you know, how do we speak about the individual and the safety? And I fully agree with you, Miriam. Like, are we having enough research and evidence on all the routes and all the complexities, or are there some that get more than others? And really calling on that data and that research to look at the routes and who are moving in different parts of the world, I think is really, really important. And that is where there's a clear connection with the IFRC's route-based approach, which is focused on the safety, you know, really at the center. And we've had many conversations around that. So I think we absolutely see, you know, the complementarity and the commonalities on that one. For us, the second one, of course, is really rooted on those alternatives early on the journey. And I think this is partly about the individuals, but I think more importantly, it's about lifting up for state dialogues. We have, of course, conventions. We have, as you pointed out, the compacts, and these are important tools. But I think bringing states together differently along the routes and talking about, you know, the how policies, law in one area, in one region, country, etc., actually influences each other, and try and have a different conversation about it, and not leave also only in a way the responsibility sharing. You spoke about the funding parts of it. There are lots of different ways of looking at that, but part of it is also that, you know, de facto it becomes the individual's courage, ability that ends up being the responsibility sharing model through irregular means. Now, is there another way to have those conversations? So I think bringing this to the states in a conversation, and that is a key aim there. You mentioned the legal pathways, Miriam, that we think are central, but also the refugee protection along the routes. And then finally, the states, you know, how do you manage this? And I think, of course, there are vulnerabilities across, and I think you're speaking, do we need new tools, other tools, etc. I think the reality is that there is still a strong case to be made that there are refugees in need of international protection, and how do we support states manage that, while also, of course, meeting the needs of vulnerability needs more broadly. And I think there the route-based approach, again, give us a focus to not talk border by border, but putting it back into some of those root causes, not the route, but the root causes, the world we live in. And here again, I think the research on the drivers, on the totality of what's going on, you know, in this world, I think is central across all of it. So I just wanted to share this. As you mentioned, I had a hard stop, so I'm going to ungraciously just leave this important meeting, and thank you all for this opportunity and for the organizing this conversation, which is very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for that contribution. And Madeline, we'll come back to you for your final thoughts before we conclude. I would say conclude, but maybe sort of, you know, end this chapter of the conversation, because there's so much obviously that we need to continue in the weeks and months ahead. So Madeline, your thoughts, please.
Thank you, James, and really thank you to the participants for their thoughtful engagement and ideas. It's really, really significant and valuable to help us all in developing our thinking in this area. Perhaps on the question of the terminology or the politics of labeling, I think it's important perhaps to think of this really not about semantics or about wordsmithing or labeling per se, but rather about making the most of rights and instruments that we have. Because, you know, we have some very important principles that have been laid down in international law and have been observed in practice by states over many, many decades. And some of them are universal principles. And it's really important, of course, to see that we have, thinking about this in reverse chronological order, you know, at regional level today, agreements between states that are extraordinarily important in this sphere. And I'm thinking about the inter-American system and the way in which the human rights treaties in that system, as interpreted and applied by the court, have made very clear that there are crucial human rights that apply to everybody on the move. And similarly, in the African regional systems, the AU, important work there in sub-regional organizations in the African context in different parts of the continent, important treaties and principles that have been elaborated and are being applied to people across the board. In the European Union, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which sets out very clearly human rights principles. But in addition, we also have specific refugee instruments, and they are there, of course, for a reason. And they have been specifically framed to provide principles of international protection for people who have fled persecution on very specific grounds, in circumstances which means that they have lost the protection of their state and they cannot be returned to their countries of origin, or indeed even be exposed to the control or jurisdiction of their countries of origin because of that very real risk of persecution. And so it's about making sure that those universal rights are respected for all those on the move, but also that those refugee principles are upheld where they are applicable and relevant. And if we say that there's no need to make distinctions, then we're going to expose refugees to very serious risks, because states do see that they have far wider margins for discretion in the way in which they respond to migrants, and particularly when it comes to the question of removal to the territory. And international law must be respected in this area, or we all face a very significant problem. Now, are these existing instruments that we all recognize we need to continue to uphold and promote, are they enough? I think not. And that's why we have the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, because we recognize that the principles we have today run into significant challenges of implementation in today's dynamics. And so those two compacts aim to set out specific principles, objectives, commitments that states have voluntarily taken on that will help ensure greater access to rights for all people on the move. And the different compacts explore the specific challenges that face refugees and migrants, and they also have many commonalities. And we, as part of the UN network on migration that is required to support the implementation of the GCM, for example, we are constantly looking at the ways in which those interlinkages and the synergies can be maximized to ensure that people are not falling between the gaps and that there isn't an artificial distinction that means that somebody's rights go unrespected. I think it's also really important, and Leonard, thank you for your question about this. You know, do we indeed need to be looking for new protocols to ensure that migrants can be respected? I would say arguably yes. We do have some important treaties. There is the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families, which is unfortunately not sufficiently widely ratified. So let us all hope and let us continue to work on the basis of the important foundation laid by the Migration Compact to see what can be done to move towards stronger binding principles that will more effectively and comprehensively protect migrants' rights. The way to do that would not be through a new refugee protocol, as you've phrased it in your question, because that relates, as I've said, to these very distinct instruments and the scope of those that are already there performing an important role for refugees. But indeed, let's see what can be done to protect people on the move. Ideally, we would hope, as thinking and practice of states evolves on this area, that we could move in the future to more binding principles. You mentioned specifically transit countries. I sometimes think that it's not always so useful that we talk distinctly about countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, because actually in some ways countries can be and are all three. And sometimes when people use the language of transit country, it seems to suggest that those states are somehow off the hook for their binding obligations to offer protection for people on the move. And that's not the case. They need to be able to provide access to rights to migrants and refugees on their territory, and not simply wave them onward and say they should keep going north because that's where they belong. On the contrary, we need to be supporting them to better cope with challenges this may create, but also making clear their obligations to engage as well. I think on the questions that some have also raised. I see Opportunata and also Abeba asking about causes. I think that's an important one too. I think what we are looking at, it's not a cause-based approach. What we've tried to do is make clear that the causes of movement can be very varied. And yes, we see people on the move in the context of climate change, in the context of generalized violence, in the context of non-state agents that are persecuting, and many other phenomena. This should be a response for refugees and migrants alike that can ensure better access to protection for them without having to determine and look specifically in the first place at the cause of their movement. And that we hope can mean that there's going to be a more comprehensive response. Perhaps on Abeba's important question too, I could just say there, how are mandates to be addressed? How mandates should be addressed is through cooperation. We have really important actors who are at work in this field, UN agencies, international organizations, national civil society organizations, refugee-led organizations, migrants organizations. We all need to be working together more effectively. There's some very good and important and clear mandates in the UN system, but nobody can do it all alone. And that's precisely why we need to be recognizing that there are different and complex aspects to the challenges in this area, but we all need to be pitching in together. There is enough work to be done for all of us. We don't need to be competing for it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Madeline. And I think that's really the perfect note on which to bring this stage in this conversation, to bring it to a conclusion. I was reflecting in the answers about how different this conversation is, or the opportunity to have this conversation is so different now than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago. The notion of complementarity, the notion of thinking outside of silos, that notion of cooperation, but also that humility in recognizing that the approaches that have been advanced for 20, 25, 30, 40 years, that these haven't led to solutions, however you define a solution. And so, Matthew, to your point about zero-sum approaches, it's not working for anybody. And so this notion about how we can develop new approaches that can square some of these circles, and I think what we've seen in the webinar today is the real importance of dialogue. And Madeline, I really thank you for your generosity of time and your candor in engaging with this conversation. I think that's really critically important. But also, Matthew and Miriam, you've really substantively demonstrated the really significant importance of ensuring that these conversations are really foregrounded in the research and the knowledge and the perspectives of those closest to the phenomenon and most affected by displacement. And so, this process that Rula introduced at the beginning of the webinar of localizing knowledge and supporting research in context is not just a morally desirable thing to do. It's a critically important, substantively useful thing to do. So we've raised more questions than we've provided answers through this discussion. This is something that will continue over time. Madeline, we look forward to remaining in touch with you and colleagues at UNHCR. And I know that the chairs, and in addition to the chairs in Thailand, Lebanon, and Tanzania, I see that Abeba from Ethiopia was also with us today. So quite a bit more to say on this. But for now, my sincere thanks to all of the speakers for your candor and your depth of engagement. It made for a very, very rich and compelling discussion. My thanks to everyone in the audience who stayed with us for some extra time. All of you watching this video after the fact, I think you'll agree that this really provides rich and compelling context in which this conversation can move forward. A sincere thanks to Nadia, Beatrice, and the whole team at Learn for making the magic happen, along with Shuchi and colleagues in the network for coordinating these interventions. Mark your calendars now for our next webinar. It will be at the same time as this webinar on the 30th of January. We'll benefit from a conversation with Andrew Harper, the Special Advisor on Climate Action with UNHCR, in conversation with Amal Ouassif in Morocco, part of Miriam's chair. Miriam will be moderating that conversation. We'll also hear from Opportuna Kweka, the IDRC chair in Tanzania, and Desiree Del Rocio, the IDRC chair in the Dominican Republic. But for now, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, for everyone involved. Wherever you're joining us from, stay well and stay safe. We look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.